June 28, 1914. A single bullet fired in Sarajevo would ignite a chain reaction that would engulf the world. Europe, a continent of immense wealth, culture, and influence, was teetering on the edge of chaos. Empires that had stood for centuries, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Russia, Britain, and France, were locked in a delicate web of alliances, rivalries, and unspoken threats. Peace, fragile and fleeting, masked a continent bristling with tension. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, seemed at first a local tragedy, a political crime in a Balkan city often dismissed by Vienna as inconsequential. Yet beneath the surface, the gears of a vast military-industrial machine were already turning. Armies had been expanding, fortifications had been reinforced, and the world's major powers had been preparing for a conflict that many quietly anticipated, yet none could fully imagine. In this world of diplomatic intrigue and secret agreements, the question remains: who truly started World War I? Was it the assassin, a lone nationalist acting out of ideology? Or was it the complex network of empires, each with their own ambitions, that set the stage for a war of unprecedented scale? By the summer of 1914, nationalism burned fiercely across Europe. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, a multi-ethnic conglomerate struggling to maintain cohesion, faced internal unrest. Serbia, emboldened by Slavic unity and Russian support, pressed its own claims. Germany, confident in its rising industrial and military might, prepared to assert its influence. Meanwhile, Britain and France watched cautiously, calculating the balance of power and weighing the cost of intervention. The assassination would become the spark, but the tinder had been accumulating for decades. Militarism, imperial ambition, and a century of unresolved tensions created a volatile environment. In the weeks following Sarajevo, a series of diplomatic missteps and ultimatums escalated a regional crisis into a continental catastrophe. Within days, alliances activated. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Russia mobilized to protect its Slavic neighbor. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, prepared for war on two fronts. France, bound by treaty to Russia, faced the inevitability of confrontation. And Britain, hesitant yet watchful, would soon be drawn into the maelstrom. The world stood at the brink. In quiet offices in Vienna, Berlin, and St. Petersburg, diplomats and generals debated the consequences of action. Yet even as they deliberated, the mechanisms of war were already in motion. Armies were mobilizing, railways were loaded with troops and artillery, and naval fleets moved into position. What followed would be a war unlike any before it. Vast, mechanized, and unforgiving. Entire generations of young men would march into a conflict shaped not only by politics and strategy, but by fear, misunderstanding, and human error. The story of who truly started World War I is not simple. It is a story of human ambition, national pride, and the inexorable momentum of history itself. As we begin this exploration, we must step carefully into that world. A Europe where every decision, every miscalculation, carried the weight of empires, and where a single act of violence could and did change the course of history forever. The roots of the Great War stretch far deeper than the assassination in Sarajevo. To understand why Europe erupted in 1914, one must first trace the complex political, military, and social currents that had been building for decades. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Europe was a continent of competing empires. The British Empire, at its zenith, held dominion over vast swathes of territory across Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. France, recovering from the humiliations of the Franco-Prussian War, sought to maintain its influence and safeguard its colonies. Germany, newly unified in 1871, had emerged as a formidable industrial and military power, seeking recognition and respect among older empires. Austria-Hungary, a patchwork of nationalities, struggled to maintain internal cohesion, while Russia aspired to assert itself as the protector of Slavic peoples. Imperial ambitions created tension at every turn. The Balkans in particular became a flashpoint. Serbia, driven by nationalism and the idea of uniting all South Slavs, increasingly challenged Austro-Hungarian authority. Meanwhile, Germany pursued its own interests in Eastern Europe, subtly encouraging Austria-Hungary to act decisively against Serbia, confident that a conflict could be contained. Militarism compounded these tensions. Across the continent, nations had been expanding armies and modernizing weapons at unprecedented rates. Germany's Schlieffen Plan envisioned a swift defeat of France followed by a pivot to the Eastern Front, a strategy that assumed rapid mobilization and precise execution. Russia, slow to industrialize but vast in manpower, prepared to meet any threat with overwhelming numbers. France invested heavily in fortifications along its eastern border. Britain, ever mindful of its naval supremacy, maintained the Royal Navy as a deterrent while watching continental developments warily. Alliances were equally critical. The Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, faced the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain. These agreements, intended as deterrents, instead created a tinderbox. A local conflict could no longer remain local. When one power moved, allies were compelled to follow, and obligations written on paper became inexorable commands for war. Technological advances intensified the stakes. Railroads allowed for rapid troop movement. Telegraphs enabled faster communication. Modern artillery, machine guns, and newly developed explosives promised both unprecedented destruction and an illusion of control. Commanders believed that precise planning could dictate outcomes, yet the reality of large-scale war would soon prove otherwise. Economics and nationalism further fueled tension. Industrialized nations competed for markets and raw materials. Populations, stirred by nationalist sentiment, demanded assertive action to defend honor and influence. Propaganda cultivated loyalty while demonizing potential adversaries, creating a climate in which diplomacy was increasingly difficult. By 1914, Europe was a continent primed for conflict. Diplomats debated, generals drilled, and ordinary citizens lived under the shadow of uncertainty. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand did not create this environment, it merely revealed its inevitability. As Sarajevo erupted in violence, the powers of Europe moved into action with remarkable speed. Ultimatums were delivered. Mobilizations were ordered. Each empire acted in ways they believed were defensive, yet the cumulative effect was aggression. Historical hindsight allows us to see the pattern clearly. A continent entangled in alliances, armed to the teeth and psychologically conditioned for war. One misstep, one bullet could, and did, set the wheels of disaster in motion. In this tense atmosphere, decision-makers believed that strength, decisiveness, and preparedness would prevent catastrophe. Yet they were operating in a world of assumptions and misjudgments, where nationalism, pride, and fear often outweighed reason. The stage was set for a war that would engulf millions, redefine borders, and challenge the very notion of modern warfare. By the summer of 1914, Europe's major powers were not merely waiting, they were preparing. Behind the closed doors of military headquarters, meticulous plans were drawn, strategies rehearsed, and contingencies calculated. These were the frameworks that commanders believed would deliver swift victories, yet in their precision lay the seeds of unforeseen disaster. Germany, confident in its industrial and military might, had long relied on the Schlieffen Plan. Devised at the turn of the century, it was a strategy of audacious simplicity. Defeat France quickly by sweeping through Belgium, then redirect forces eastward to confront Russia. German generals believed that Russia, with its vast territory and slower mobilization, would allow them a window to crush France first, thereby avoiding a prolonged two-front war. The plan demanded flawless coordination, rapid troop movements, and unwavering obedience. Any delay or misstep would be catastrophic. Austria-Hungary, facing unrest among its diverse ethnic populations, sought to assert authority decisively. The empire believed that a swift strike against Serbia would quash nationalist agitation and send a clear message across the Balkans. Military planners in Vienna emphasized speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. They calculated that Serbia, small and comparatively weak, could be subdued before Russian intervention became effective. Confidence, however, did not account for the fervor of Serbian nationalism or the determination of their allies. On the other side, France had fortified its eastern frontier for decades. Defensive doctrine emphasized artillery, entrenched positions, and careful coordination with Russia. While French commanders expected an eventual confrontation with Germany, the timing, scale, and trajectory of the coming conflict remained uncertain. They trained, drilled, and stockpiled weapons, believing that preparation could offset strategic disadvantages. Russia, vast and slow to mobilize, relied on sheer manpower. Its generals recognized that speed was critical but understood their industrial limitations. Mobilization schedules were intricate and demanding, yet vulnerable to miscommunication and logistical failure. Still, Russian leaders believed that a large, determined force could overwhelm Austria-Hungary and, if necessary, tie down German forces on the Eastern Front. Britain, though geographically insulated, had long maintained a formidable navy. Its strategy emphasized blockade, sea control, and support for continental allies when necessary. While not committed to immediate land warfare, British planners understood that European conflict would likely drag them into the fray. Naval exercises and strategic positioning were designed to ensure that Britain could exert influence while avoiding catastrophic exposure. All of these strategies, individually rational, collectively created a fragile ecosystem. The great powers, confident in their plans, underestimated the unpredictability of war, the resilience of opponents, and the role of chance. Mobilization timetables were rigid. Any deviation risked cascading delays. Communication relied on telegraphs and couriers, vulnerable to misinterpretation. Commanders, steeped in doctrine, assumed that the battlefield would unfold as theory predicted. Yet even before the first shot was fired, doubts lingered. Some diplomats recognized the danger of a regional crisis spiraling into continental war. Some officers questioned whether rail lines, maps, and calculations could govern human behavior in chaos. Others believed that hesitation would invite disaster, that inaction was itself a failure. In the days following Sarajevo, these plans transitioned from theory to reality. Austria-Hungary's ultimatum to Serbia triggered Russian mobilization. Germany's Schlieffen Plan, once a theoretical exercise, became the blueprint for immediate action. France and Britain adjusted their strategies in response, and the continent moved as if caught in a single, inexorable clockwork. As armies readied themselves along borders, the tension was palpable. Soldiers packed kits, officers reviewed orders, and trains carried men and weapons to staging areas. Every movement reflected the assumptions of strategy, yet each step also introduced variables that no plan could fully anticipate. The confidence of generals, the discipline of soldiers, and the precision of logistics would soon be tested against the unpredictable realities of war. Europe stood on the precipice. Strategies crafted in quiet offices and map rooms were about to collide with the unpredictable forces of terrain, morale, weather, and human error. What commanders believed would be controlled, swift, and decisive, would instead become chaotic, brutal, and transformative. By late July 1914, the theoretical strategies of European generals were about to collide with reality. Mobilization orders became irrevocable commands, and troops moved toward borders with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. The continent, which had seemed stable for decades, now bristled with the tension of imminent conflict. Austria-Hungary acted first. Following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Vienna delivered an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding concessions that were nearly impossible to accept. When Serbia's response failed to satisfy all demands, Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28. The empire's armies, disciplined and equipped with modern rifles and artillery, advanced across the border. Initial encounters with Serbian forces were limited in scale, yet they revealed early warning signs that the conflict would not be simple. Serbian troops, though smaller in number, exhibited resilience and knowledge of their terrain. Germany's entry into the conflict transformed a regional war into a European one. The Schlieffen Plan required the rapid invasion of Belgium and northern France, and German forces crossed borders with precision and confidence. Yet the resistance encountered was immediate. Belgian fortifications, combined with determined civilian resistance, slowed the advance. The German High Command, confident in the speed of their strategy, began to confront the first cracks in their assumptions. Logistics, communication, and local resistance quickly complicated their timetable. On the Eastern Front, Russian mobilization revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of a vast empire. While the sheer number of troops demonstrated the potential to overwhelm Austria-Hungary, coordination was slow. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles, and communication delays caused confusion. Yet the advance pressed on, signaling to Vienna that the empire faced a threat greater than expected. France, observing German movements through Belgium, quickly activated defensive positions. Artillery was placed along key river crossings, and infantry units prepared to counter a swift German advance. Commanders hoped that their fortifications and the anticipation of terrain advantages would compensate for numerical or tactical disadvantages. The first skirmishes hinted at the ferocity to come. Britain, though initially hesitant to engage in land warfare, monitored the unfolding events with growing concern. The violation of Belgian neutrality, an international principle Britain had long defended, created both a moral and strategic imperative. Naval deployments were intensified, and orders were prepared to support continental allies. Though the first shots did not fall from British guns on land, the stage for a fully global conflict was already set. Early battles revealed the limits of planning. Austro-Hungarian troops underestimated Serbian resistance, German forces encountered unexpected logistical delays, and Russian advances exposed gaps in strategy. What had seemed a controlled mobilization quickly became chaotic. Officers struggled to enforce orders, soldiers faced exhaustion, and confusion spread among units unfamiliar with actual battlefield conditions. Even as the first engagements unfolded, the human dimension began to emerge. Men confronted the reality of modern war, the roar of artillery, the whine of bullets, and the smoke-filled landscapes of battlefields. Initial contact demonstrated that victory would not be simply a matter of planning. Adaptability, morale, and the capacity to endure would prove equally decisive. In the early weeks of deployment, Europe witnessed the first glimpses of a war that would escalate far beyond expectations. Strategies were tested against resilient adversaries. Logistics, once taken for granted, became a constant struggle. And as armies clashed, the fragile illusion of control shattered. The First World War, long predicted by diplomats and generals, had begun in earnest, and the reality of combat revealed both the ambition and hubris of those who set the stage. The first clashes of 1914 shattered illusions. What had been meticulously planned in headquarters, rehearsed on maps, and calculated in theory, now collided with the unpredictable and unforgiving nature of war. The disciplined movements of armies gave way to confusion, miscommunication, and chaos. On the Eastern Front, Russian troops advanced into East Prussia, confident in their numerical advantage. Yet the vast distances, poor infrastructure, and logistical inefficiencies immediately became apparent. Supply lines faltered. Communication between units broke down. Troops faced hunger, fatigue, and the unforgiving terrain of forests and marshlands. Inexperience among junior officers compounded the difficulties. Initial enthusiasm gave way to exhaustion, and the human cost of mobilization became clear before a single major battle had been fought. Austro-Hungarian forces in Serbia met a resistance that exceeded expectations. Serbian soldiers, familiar with the rugged terrain and fueled by nationalism, conducted effective defensive maneuvers and ambushes. Austrian artillery, while formidable on paper, often fell short against the nimble and determined Serbian infantry. The empire's commanders had anticipated swift victories, but reality exposed both tactical misjudgments and an underestimation of the enemy. Casualties mounted, morale wavered, and the first cracks in the aura of invincibility appeared. In the West, Germany's Schlieffen Plan began to strain under the weight of reality. The invasion of Belgium, intended to be rapid and decisive, met unexpectedly fierce resistance. Belgian fortresses delayed the German advance. Civilians fled or resisted in small but impactful ways. Supply lines stretched thin and coordination between army corps faltered. Officers realized that war was not a series of predictable calculations, but a dynamic environment shaped by human resilience, chance, and error. France, confronted with the German advance, faced the stark contrast between theoretical defense and battlefield reality. Fortifications, artillery placements, and troop positions did not always align with the evolving front lines. Orders, delayed or misunderstood, created confusion. Soldiers, facing real combat for the first time, experienced fear, disorientation, and the brutal awakening to the chaos of modern war. Even the technological advantages that had been heralded as decisive, artillery, machine guns, railroads, proved both powerful and problematic. Shells misfired, trains were delayed, and communication systems faltered under stress. Commanders confronted the sobering truth. Preparation in theory could not fully dictate the outcome once bullets, cannon fire, and human uncertainty entered the equation. The psychological impact was immediate. Officers accustomed to discipline and obedience struggled to maintain control. Soldiers, facing carnage beyond imagination, grappled with shock, fear, and a sense of vulnerability. The war revealed itself as not only a test of strategy but a trial of endurance, courage, and resilience under extreme pressure. What was intended as swift action rapidly escalated into a war of attrition. The initial movements, meant to secure advantage and demonstrate power, instead exposed weaknesses, miscalculations, and the limits of human foresight. The battlefield, vast and chaotic, became a place where plans unraveled and the stark reality of modern conflict dominated. By the end of these first engagements, the narrative of controlled, precise military action had dissolved. Commanders began to understand that the war they envisioned was already diverging from the one they faced. Europe was no longer a continent on the brink, it was a continent in motion, hurtling toward destruction. War is measured not only in strategies and casualties but in the quiet suffering of those who endure it. By the autumn of 1914, the initial illusions of glory and discipline had dissolved, replaced by the relentless psychological and physical toll of the battlefield. Soldiers, often mere boys in age, confronted the unrelenting pressure of combat. Fatigue became an omnipresent companion. Marches across mud-soaked fields, exposure to harsh weather, and the weight of rifles, ammunition, and equipment drained strength before men even faced the enemy. Sleep was sporadic, often interrupted by artillery fire or the urgent orders of officers. Hunger gnawed at the edges of morale. Supply lines, already strained, could not always deliver adequate rations, and soldiers learned to survive on what little they could scavenge or carry. Fear was constant. The roar of machine guns, the whistle of artillery shells, and the stench of smoke and cordite created an environment of persistent terror. Men grappled with the knowledge that death could come in an instant, indiscriminate and impersonal. Letters from home, brief glimpses of camaraderie, or fleeting moments of humor offered respite, yet these were fragile and temporary shields against the pervasive anxiety. In the trenches, conditions were horrific. Mud and water collected in deep craters, turning positions into quagmires. Disease spread easily. Dysentery, lice and frostbite were constant threats. Soldiers became witnesses to the suffering of their comrades. Wounds, both visible and invisible, tested the limits of endurance. The sound of screaming, the sight of mangled bodies, and the smell of decay left psychological scars that would last lifetimes. Despite the horror, acts of bravery and solidarity emerged. Soldiers learned to rely on one another, forming bonds that transcended nationality and background. Shared hardship created a fragile network of trust, a mutual understanding that survival depended on cohesion. Yet this camaraderie existed alongside despair, as men watched friends fall to the indiscriminate forces of modern warfare. Letters, diaries, and oral accounts from the front reveal the intimate reality of fear and resilience. A young Austrian conscript might describe the cold of a rainy October night, the relentless mud of the Serbian front, and the quiet terror of enemy artillery. A French infantryman in the Ardennes would recount the disorienting chaos of the first German bombardment, the shouts of officers drowned by explosions, and the overwhelming sensory assault that defined the opening weeks of war. These experiences were universal across all armies. Russian soldiers in East Prussia, German conscripts in Belgium, and British forces preparing for eventual engagement all faced the same human challenges. Individual valor, ingenuity, and endurance often mattered as much as strategic planning. Survival depended on adapting to the relentless pressures of a world suddenly transformed by industrialized violence. The human cost extended beyond the front lines. Families waited anxiously, uncertain whether letters would arrive or whether sons, fathers, and brothers would ever return. Communities endured the absence of men who were now caught in a war whose scale and intensity no one had anticipated. The psychological toll of separation, anxiety, and grief began to affect societies in ways that would become increasingly visible as the conflict stretched into months and years. By understanding the human experience, we gain insight into the true nature of war. Strategy, tactics, and technology are vital, but the battlefield is ultimately shaped by individuals, by their courage, fear, resilience, and suffering. World War I, in its earliest stages, revealed not only the limits of planning but the profound depths of human endurance when faced with the unimaginable. War is a dialogue, often violent, between opposing forces. To understand the full scope of World War I, one must examine not only the strategies of one side but also the perspective of the enemy, how adversaries observed, adapted, and responded to the unfolding chaos. From the Serbian perspective, the Austro-Hungarian invasion was both terrifying and galvanizing. Outnumbered and outgunned, Serbian troops relied on intimate knowledge of their rugged homeland. Commanders employed defensive tactics that capitalized on mountains, forests, and narrow passes. Guerrilla-style ambushes, rapid repositioning, and small-unit ingenuity frustrated larger Austrian formations. Civilians contributed as well, guiding troops through the terrain, relaying information, and enduring the hardships of war alongside their soldiers. In Belgium, German forces encountered resistance they had not fully anticipated. Belgian fortresses, constructed decades earlier, were modernized and manned with determined troops. Civilians, too, engaged in passive resistance, obstructing roads, delaying German movements, and providing intelligence to defenders. The German High Command, confident in a rapid advance, was forced to adjust its timetable and reconsider the logistical demands of an extended campaign. French commanders observed the German advance with increasing alarm and urgency. Rapid decisions were made to reinforce fortifications, redeploy troops, and counteract what had been intended as a swift German strike. Officers relied on reconnaissance, intelligence, and coordination with Russian allies to anticipate enemy movements. The French perspective highlighted the importance of adaptability, as plans conceived in peacetime proved inadequate when confronted with the realities of a mobile, aggressive opponent. Russia, moving into East Prussia, faced its own unexpected challenges. While numerical superiority promised eventual dominance, German defensive positions, fortified railways, and strategic reserves slowed the Russian advance. Communication failures compounded the difficulty of coordinating multiple armies across vast distances. From the Russian perspective, victory required not just brute force but careful attention to logistics, terrain, and the psychological state of troops stretched thin by continuous movement and combat. Even the British, observing from afar, studied German and continental movements to prepare for potential engagement. Naval intelligence, reports from diplomats, and aerial reconnaissance were crucial in understanding the strategies and limitations of both enemies and allies. Britain's eventual decision to enter the war was influenced as much by the actions of adversaries as by obligations to allies and principles of international law. Across all fronts, the enemy perspective revealed a shared reality. War was unpredictable, chaotic, and unforgiving. Plans, no matter how precise, were constantly challenged by terrain, weather, morale, and improvisation. Commanders who anticipated smooth execution confronted a brutal calculus of adaptation and reaction. In every theater, the enemy was not an abstraction but a human force, intelligent, adaptive, and determined. Understanding the enemy perspective also illuminates the moral and psychological dimensions of war. Soldiers, often young and untested, faced the same fears, fatigue, and confusion as their opponents. Decisions made in the heat of battle, whether to advance, retreat, or hold ground, carried consequences not just for strategy but for the lives of countless individuals. The interplay of opposing perspectives created a dynamic, lethal environment in which no side held absolute certainty. The early months of World War I demonstrated that victory would not come from superiority in theory alone. It required observation, adaptation, and an acute understanding of how the opponent might respond. The enemy was an ever-present variable, forcing commanders to reassess assumptions, recalibrate plans, and confront the sobering reality that war is never entirely under control. By the end of 1914, the nature of the conflict had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a series of swift maneuvers and localized engagements evolved into an extended, grinding confrontation. Armies, initially confident in the precision of their plans, were forced to adapt to the realities of modern, industrialized warfare. On the Western Front, the German advance through Belgium and northern France had slowed, encountering fortifications, resilient defenders, and logistical bottlenecks. Commanders recognized that their initial timetable, once expected to deliver a rapid victory, was no longer viable. New strategies emerged. Trench networks, artillery barrages, and fortified positions became the new foundation of military operations. Movement gave way to entrenchment, and the battlefield became a static, brutal environment of attrition. French forces, adapting to the German incursion, implemented counteroffensives designed to exploit gaps in enemy lines. Intelligence, reconnaissance, and the careful positioning of artillery were crucial in halting advances and preserving critical territory. Coordination with British forces, who had now committed ground troops following Belgium's violation of neutrality, further emphasized the need for flexibility in planning. What was initially assumed to be a short campaign now demanded sustained strategic foresight and improvisation under pressure. On the Eastern Front, Russian armies faced similar challenges. While numerical superiority remained an advantage, the combination of terrain, harsh winter conditions, and logistical strain forced adaptations in tactics. Commanders refined supply routes, reassigned units to exploit weaknesses, and incorporated lessons learned from early setbacks. The Russian perspective highlighted the importance of resilience, improvisation, and the ability to adjust expectations in the face of unforeseen obstacles. Austria-Hungary confronted the persistent challenge of Serbian resistance. Initial assumptions of rapid conquest had proven dangerously optimistic. Commanders revised operational plans, reallocating forces and relying more heavily on coordinated artillery support. The empire's leadership recognized that victory required not only firepower but the strategic exploitation of terrain, timing, and intelligence. Adaptation became a matter of survival rather than choice. Across all fronts, the technological dimension of war evolved rapidly. Artillery, machine guns, and early forms of indirect fire reshaped the battlefield. Armies developed new formations and tactics to mitigate the devastating effects of modern weaponry. Trenches, barbed wire, and fortified positions became essential defensive structures, redefining the conduct of war. Mobility was constrained. Attrition became the dominant strategy. Commanders, once confident in the efficacy of rapid offensives, now confronted the necessity of enduring and adapting to protracted conflict. The human dimension reflected this escalation. Soldiers faced increasingly static but deadly environments, where long periods of waiting were punctuated by intense bursts of violence. Morale, leadership, and cohesion became critical to survival. The psychological strain of constant exposure to artillery, the ever-present threat of death, and the sight of fallen comrades demanded new forms of discipline and resilience. Diplomatically, the war's escalation drew in new participants and expanded theaters. Nations reassessed alliances, sought new commitments, and prepared for prolonged engagement. Economic and industrial resources were mobilized at unprecedented scale, further entrenching the war as a total effort. What had begun as a regional crisis now encompassed a continental, and soon global, conflict. By late 1914, adaptation was no longer a tactical choice but a necessity. Strategies evolved in response to unexpected resistance, technological realities, and human endurance. The war had begun to define itself, rather than following the neat outlines of pre-war plans. Armies, nations, and individuals were compelled to respond to forces beyond their control, shaping the character and duration of what would become one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. By the end of 1914, the initial expectations of war had been decisively shattered. Battles meant to secure rapid victories had instead produced staggering casualties, drawn-out stalemates, and the beginning of a conflict that no one had fully anticipated. The consequences of these early campaigns would reverberate across Europe for years to come. On the Western Front, the German advance had been halted. Belgium's resistance and the combined efforts of French and British forces prevented the swift conquest that the Schlieffen Plan had envisioned. By November, the front had stabilized into an intricate system of trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. The illusion of rapid, decisive action gave way to the brutal reality of positional warfare, where progress came at the cost of thousands of lives and immense material expenditure. The Eastern Front saw mixed results. Russian advances into East Prussia demonstrated both the power and the vulnerability of a vast empire. While Russian forces inflicted some damage, they suffered severe setbacks at the hands of German counterattacks. Austria-Hungary, struggling against Serbian resistance, was forced to divert troops and resources, highlighting the fragility of multi-ethnic empires confronting motivated, determined opponents. These early clashes foreshadowed the drawn-out nature of a war that would consume the continent in its entirety. Strategically, the outcomes revealed the limits of planning and the dangers of underestimating both geography and human resilience. Germany's carefully crafted timetable failed, Austria-Hungary underestimated Serbian determination, Russia's logistical strain became painfully apparent, and France and Britain discovered the immense cost of defending territory against modern mechanized firepower. The tactical and operational lessons of 1914 would inform subsequent campaigns, but only at immense human and material cost. The human consequences were equally staggering. Casualty figures in the tens of thousands, wounded and dead, underscored the deadly efficiency of modern weaponry. Soldiers endured physical and psychological trauma, while civilian populations faced displacement, hunger, and terror. Communities across Europe felt the war's immediate impact, as the conflict permeated every layer of society. The scale and intensity of suffering foreshadowed the unprecedented nature of total war that would define the coming years. Politically, the early months of the war destabilized existing governments and alliances. Austria-Hungary's inability to subdue Serbia revealed cracks in imperial authority. Germany's failure to achieve a rapid victory forced reassessments of strategy and revealed vulnerabilities in the command structure. Russia's partial successes and failures exposed the strain of mobilizing a vast, multi-regional army. Britain and France solidified their commitment, recognizing that withdrawal or compromise was no longer an option. Economically, nations began to mobilize entire societies. Factories converted to wartime production. Transportation networks were repurposed for military logistics. Agricultural and industrial outputs were directed toward sustaining armies and civilian populations under siege conditions. The financial burden of war, initially underestimated, would grow exponentially, shaping post-war economies and political decisions. Culturally, the war's early phase shattered illusions of heroic conflict. The glorified visions of quick, decisive battles gave way to the stark, pervasive reality of attrition. Poetry, literature, and first-hand accounts began to capture the human cost, chronicling experiences of fear, fatigue, and the struggle to survive. These narratives would inform generations, providing a window into the consequences of globalized, industrial warfare. By the close of 1914, Europe had transformed. The war had moved beyond the realm of political maneuvering and theoretical planning. It had become a tangible, devastating force affecting every aspect of life. The early outcomes were a sobering reminder that the human, logistical, and strategic dimensions of conflict were far more complex than the confident proclamations of generals and statesmen. The continent had entered a conflict that would reshape its borders, societies, and very understanding of warfare. The war that erupted in 1914 left a legacy that would shape the 20th century and beyond. The events of the first year alone revealed profound truths about the nature of modern conflict, the limits of human planning, and the catastrophic consequences of political miscalculation. Strategically, World War I demonstrated that industrialized nations, armed with modern weaponry and massed armies, could transform any localized conflict into a prolonged, continental catastrophe. The early expectations of rapid, decisive victories proved tragically optimistic. Armies clashed not as abstract forces on maps but as human beings enduring mud, bullets, disease, and fear. The lesson was clear: technological and numerical superiority does not guarantee success. Adaptability, logistics, and morale are equally decisive. Politically, the war exposed the fragility of empires and the perils of entangled alliances. Austria-Hungary struggled to maintain cohesion in the face of nationalist uprisings. Germany's early confidence belied the complexity of fighting a two-front war. Russia faced internal strains that would ultimately contribute to revolution. France and Britain, though victorious in halting enemy advances, were drawn into a conflict far larger than anticipated. The intricate web of alliances that had been intended to preserve peace instead magnified the scale of war. The human cost shaped societies in profound ways. Millions of soldiers experienced trauma, illness, and disillusionment. Communities across Europe mourned unprecedented losses. The psychological and social effects of the war would ripple through generations, influencing art, literature, and collective memory. Families, once confident in the stability of empire and nation, were confronted with the fragility of life and the unpredictability of global events. Economically, nations learned the immense demands of total war. Industrial and agricultural systems were repurposed for sustained military production. Governments assumed unprecedented control over resources, labor, and finance. The early months revealed that modern war required the mobilization not just of armies, but of entire societies. Lessons learned would influence military, political, and economic planning for decades. Diplomatically, the war's outbreak emphasized the dangers of miscommunication, miscalculation, and the underestimation of adversaries. Minor incidents, when compounded by alliances, national pride, and bureaucratic rigidity, could spiral into continental catastrophe. Historians and strategists would study 1914 to understand how small decisions, such as an ultimatum or a single mobilization order, could ignite global conflict. Culturally, World War I reshaped perceptions of heroism, duty, and sacrifice. The early months shattered romantic notions of war, replacing them with stark accounts of endurance, suffering, and the resilience of ordinary men and women. Literature, memoirs, and visual art would reflect the shock and trauma of a generation, providing insight into the human dimensions of large-scale industrial warfare. In retrospect, the War of 1914 serves as both warning and lesson. It illustrates the dangers of overconfidence, the unpredictability of human and technological systems, and the profound consequences of entangled alliances. The first year, with its strategies, failures, and human suffering, is a microcosm of the conflict's enduring truths. Understanding these lessons is essential, not to glorify war but to comprehend its complexity, cost, and consequences. The story of who really started World War I is thus inseparable from the broader historical currents. It is a tale of ambition, fear, misjudgment, and circumstance. The assassination in Sarajevo may have been the spark, but the tinder had been decades in the making. Europe's empires, militaries, and societies were primed for conflict, and once ignited, the fire reshaped the world forever. As history reflects upon the first year of the Great War, the legacy is clear. Modern conflict is as much about preparation, perception, and human resilience as it is about strategy and weapons. The lessons of 1914 endure, a solemn reminder of the forces that can transform a continent and the cost of miscalculation on the scale of nations.